Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. We're studying today with Professor Dreyfus. By way of introduction, he has an enormous resume. He left his native Switzerland in 1970 and went to India, where he studied on an intense training for the degree of Geshe. He was awarded the degree of Larampa Geshe in 1985, 15 years later. He was the first Western student to be so honored. And after that, he went to the United States and he completed an MA degree and a PhD degree at the University of Virginia under Professor Jeffrey Hopkins. So it's an incredible background, incredible knowledge. So Professor Dreyfus is now the Jackson Professor of Religion at Williams College in Massachusetts. And one of his main areas of interest is the study of consciousness, an interest that he has developed through an association with the Mind and Life Institute. So thank you so much, Professor. We're so honored to have you.
Okay, thank you. So I hope everybody's okay. Here is what I was asked to teach this text, the Vimalakirti Sutra. I strongly advise to all of you to get it. How many people do have it? Sorry, I don't see everybody.
No. Professor, on the website, on the Shantideva website, we have a link to the translation by Dr. Thurman on the 84,000 website, 84,000.com.
Okay,
website.
okay.
So I'll put that link in the chat.
Okay, because basically, okay, so here we go. This is the
Professor
Sutra.
Dreyfus, if
Yes?
you were saying you can't see everyone, but if you change your view to gallery view, then you'll be able to see all the participants.
Okay. View to gallery view. Yeah, because I don't need to see myself in big, so it's much better if I see everybody. Okay, so I was asked to speak about this text. So I am in two minds about doing this. One mind is that this is a really difficult text. It may not look to you so difficult because it's narrative, but actually this is much harder than any kind of philosophical text that we study in the monastic curriculum, because philosophical texts have a logic on their own. This is a narrative text and it's a very profound text. And so I am going to go through that text. I have no pretension of understanding fully that text. When we study in the monastery, we study the Prajnaparamita literature, and we study it in two ways. One is Madhyamika, which is basically the Prajnamula text that we did. When was it? 2 years ago, last year? Something like that, right? And the other text is Vyabhisamalankara, which talks about the Buddhist path as it appears in the Prajnaparamita's literature. And you may think the Madhyamika is the hard part, but you're wrong. Madhyamika is the easy part. We do that in 2 years. Talking of the path, we do it in 5 or 7 years, depending on the curriculum. And that tells you it's much, much, much more difficult, much more complicated. And so to understand that text is actually much harder in a way than talking about Madhyamika. And so I want us to understand this from the start. So today I will talk about the beginning of the text. I will explain you what is the Mahayana Sutra, how we can understand the Mahayana Sutra from a scholarly point of view. And then we'll start the sutra, and we'll probably work until, what is this chapter where the Buddha and all the disciples, and that will be for today. Then we will have 2 more meetings. Okay, so if we read the text, it says, reverence to all Buddha, Bodhisattva, Arya, Shravaka, and Pratyeka Buddha in the past, the present, and the future. I have no idea whether this is part of the original text or not, or whether this was added, but thus have I heard at one time. So thus I have heard is the way Buddhist scriptures start, right? All Buddhist scriptures start, thus I have heard. And we need to talk about that sentence at length, because we, as far as basic Buddhism is concerned, we know who the I is. For example, for the sutra in the basic Buddhist canon, we know that the I is supposed to be Ananda. Now, doesn't mean we read exactly what Ananda heard, but at least we know the name of the person, and we know a little bit of the history of the transmission of this text. So we'll have to talk about that. Thus I have heard. The Lord Buddha was in residence in the garden of Amrapali in the city of Vaishali, attended by a great gathering. All bhikshus, there were 8,000 all saints. They were free from impurity, all attained self-mastery. Their mind liberated by perfect knowledge, etc. Next paragraph. O Bodhisattva, there were 32,000 great spiritual heroes who were universally acclaimed. They were dedicated through the penetrating activity of the great super knowledge and were sustained by the grace of the Buddha, and so on. So, what do you notice? What do you notice?
There were a lot of people there.
Yeah, and that strikes you like how?
And
Yeah,
they were
exactly.
they were all like arhats or very evolved. They were all bodhisattvas.
And what do you make of that?
It feels a lot like the painting, like the paintings of the merit fields.
Okay, yeah. Now, the painting of the merit field is based on texts like that, right? So the text is, I think, comes way before. But what do you make of all these people?
They were not yet Buddhas, and so they
now it says in the garden of Amrapali in the city of Vaishali, right? So I counted how many bodhisattvas, 32,000, and then only 8,000 bhikkhus. So we are up to 40,000 people, plus all the gods and so on. So what do you make of that?
They weren't all from India?
What?
They were not all from India. Maybe.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, excuse me? They were from other levels of existence, perhaps.
Okay. So what does that tell you?
It was a really big garden.
Okay. How do you make literature? How do you make literature? Question is whether this is literature or whether a description of what happened, right?
So literature is nonfiction, so it often exaggerates.
Literature is fiction, right?
Literature is fiction, sorry.
Yes.
It's not nonfiction. Yeah, right.
Yeah, so you
But
think
I
this
thought-
is fiction or nonfiction? Or you think this is the wrong question to ask?
I think it's the wrong question to ask, Frank.
Why?
Because I think that in some ways, the issue of whether or not it is, quote, literally true or in some other way true is at least to me, it's not that interesting a question. The question
Okay.
is what's being said here. And what's being said, I think, is that whoever wrote this is setting the scene
Yes.
and is trying to set a scene of epic proportions.
Yes,
And
exactly.
the person is saying that this is an epic. It's taking place in a large garden. It happens to be, by the way, approximately the size of Madison Square Garden here in New York.
Yeah, I think I don't know the Amrapali garden, but I think it's much smaller than, but you know, the Prajnaparamita is taught on the Vulture Peak, right? Anybody has been to the Vulture Peak? I have not. It's really doesn't fit so many people, right?
No, maybe about 40 at the
Yeah,
most.
something like that. I don't know, 40, 100. Anyway, so what we're talking about exactly is something else, right? And so we have to ask, what are Mahayana sutras and where do they come from? And so this will be a large part of what we need to talk about today. Now, traditional account is that Mahayana Sutra are the teaching of Buddha Shakyamuni, and then things get a little bit nebulous because when you read the sutra in the basic canon, be it in the Pali canon or Chinese canon or the Tibetan canon, it doesn't matter. It all starts with these words, as I have heard, right? And the I who have heard that is well known to us. It's Ananda for the sutra, and it's Upali for the Vinaya. Let's leave out the Abhidharma. Now, does it mean that when we read some of the basic sutra, we are reading the words of the Buddha? Well, that's complicated, right? Because we understand that the words, the teaching of the Buddha were rehearsed after the Buddha passed away, and then they were not written down. They were passed down orally, and then there was 2 other rehearsal, and after each rehearsal, the teachings were never written down. The earliest written down teaching we have, the earliest sutta we have, are texts that were found in Afghanistan, and they date probably from around the 1st century BC or 1st century AD. This is the first Buddhist scripture that we have actual writing of. And then the next one we have are the Chinese canon, the Chinese agamas, which were translated from Sanskrit into Chinese, and starting from around the 2nd, 3rd century AD. And then after that, around 4th, 5th century AD, we have the Pali canon. We have written an exemplar of the Pali canon. We have the Pali canon in the form we have now. And then the Tibetans were even later. So obviously, when we talk about the words of the Buddha from a scholarly point of view, we have to understand that there is a great degree of uncertainty as far as the exact wording, phrasing. Sorry. Oh my God.
Hello, please leave a message after.
Oh no. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So we realize that when we say the words of the Buddha, this when talking about the basic canon, the Sutta in Pali, the Agama in Chinese, the part of the Tibetan canon that deals strictly with the basic teachings. When we say this is the word of the Buddha, you understand that the history through which these teachings come down to us is complicated, right? And so we can think about whether these are really the words of the Buddha or not. The good news there is that all the different canons and all the basic traditions of Buddhists agree on what is the basic message of the Buddha: the Four Noble Truths, karma, compassion, all these things in the basic canons, and all Buddhist traditions agree. And so we can think with some degree of confidence, this is the teaching of the Buddha, right? Yeah, the wording might not be exactly the same. Probably many things were added because this was passed down orally, but we can have some confidence that the essence, the heart of the message is that taught by the Buddha, right? Now, question is, where do the Mahayana Sutra come from? Remember the Mahayana, the first sutra were first rehearsed after the passing away of the Buddha, right? And there Ananda recited the sutra and Upali recited the Vinaya. Okay, we don't know exactly what was going on, but we have a pretty good idea of what's there, at least as far as the broad outline of the teachings. At that time, no Mahayana Sutra, right? So what happens is that around the probably first century AD, suddenly new sutras appear. These are the Mahayana Sutras. So the teaching content of this teaching, the Mahayana Sutra, is the broad outline is very easy to understand. In general, in Buddhist tradition, there are three paths, right? There is a path of the layperson who seeks to obtain a good rebirth. There is a path of the arhat, the person who seeks liberation. And then there is a path of the bodhisattva, the person who seeks to be a Buddha, right? And that we find in all Buddhist tradition, particularly in the Theravada tradition, we find all three paths. Now, in the Theravada tradition, which is what I call basic Buddhist, but it's not only the Theravada tradition, there were many basic Buddhist traditions in India. In these basic traditions, the path of the bodhisattva is understood to be for absolutely extraordinary, exceptional beings, that 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 will undertake the bodhisattva path. Everybody else should be taking the path of the arhat, which is, quote unquote, much easier. And then there the path of the lay people who are seeking a good rebirth, right? That's the outline of the basic Buddhist tradition as far as the three paths are concerned. Mahayana Sutra appear, and what do they teach? They teach, no, you should not aspire to be a arhat. You should aspire directly to be a bodhisattva and to be a Buddha. So what distinguishes the Mahayana from the rest of Buddhism is this change, this shift of emphasis in what is the normative path, right? For basic Buddhists, the normative path is the path of the arhat. the lay people obviously have something that is going to take much longer time, but that's okay. And then the path of the bodhisattva is for exceptional people. Not everybody can play piano. I don't play piano, so it's probably not true, but let's say everybody can play piano, but not everybody can be Mozart, right? So in the same way, everybody can reach enlightenment, not true. But to become Buddha is a much harder endeavor, right? That's a basic Buddhist picture. What Mahayana Sutra do is change radically this picture by saying, no, you should not take the path of the Arhat. This is an inferior path. You should take the path of the Bodhisattva and seek to become Buddha for the sake of having all sentient beings. This is what bodhicitta teachings are all about, and you are probably all of you familiar with these teachings, right? So, what the question, which is obvious, is where does this come from, right? Why is this sudden shift in emphasis? Why there is this shift from the normative, in what is considered the normative path, from the path of the Arhat, which is already hard enough, in case you don't know, to the path of the Bodhisattva that multiplied the difficulty by factors, I don't know if it's 100 or 1,000 or enormously broader, right? Wider. And so the question is, where does this come from? Now, traditional teacher will tell you it comes from the Buddha. The problem is, how was it rehearsed? We know that the teaching was rehearsed, the sutta or sutra, the basic sutra were rehearsed by Ananda. Who was this sutra rehearsed by? The answer is, oh, it's a bodhisattva like Manjushri and so on. Yeah, where is Manjushri? I'm not sure. So modern scholars, academic scholars have tried to speculate what's going on. And there are many theories, and I will mention a few so that you understand what is so strange about these teachings from the point of view of basic Buddhism. Okay, so basically, there are a couple of interesting theories. One theory, which I think is not so interesting, but has at least some interest, is that the Mahayana was a lay movement in India. And this is based on the fact that bodhisattvas, for the most part, are not monastics, right? And that's an interesting question, whether this refers to a historical dimension or whether it refers to something different, which is symbolic, right? It is remarkable that most bodhisattvas in this literature are lay people, right? And the hero here, Vimalakirti, is a layperson, right? And it's just like, yeah. So this is a literary text, right? And it puts a central figure, and that figure is not, well, it's a Buddha, but the second central figure, and actually the real central figure here is Vimalakirti, right? And Vimalakirti is a merchant, he has wife, children, and so on. And it's just like, what's going on? So some people have speculated that what's going on is that the Mahayana Sutra, the Mahayana, were mostly a lay movement. And that's one theory about the rise of the Mahayana. is that it's a lay movement in opposition to the mainstream of Buddhism, which was monastic, right? It's important to understand that up to for a long time, Mahayana was a small minority. That is the bulk of, if we read the travel of the Chinese pilgrim, Yixing and Xuanzang, we see that in Buddhist monasteries in India, there were, the enormous majority was what Mahayanists would call Hinayanists, right? And what I call basic Buddhist, right? The followers of the Mahayana Sutra were actually a small minority until maybe later 8th century, something like this, 7th, 8th century. Maybe things changed in late Indian Buddhism, but certainly for several centuries in India, Mahayana was a minority, right? It's only when Buddhism gets out of India and go to China, Japan, Tibet, and so on, that Mahayana becomes the dominant and in a way the only tradition, right? In Tibetan Buddhism is Mahayana Buddhism, right? There is no real Hinayana base, there is no real basic Buddhism except as a preparation for the Mahayana path, right? But that's something that happens when Buddhism leaves India and gets to different countries, right? Remember, if you have questions, you just raise your hand and you ask a question. That's the only way you will learn anything from me. Questions? Okay, so one theory is that Mahayana is a lay movement. That's one theory. Now, another theory, and that's the theory that I tend to think is the most plausible, is that Mahayana Sutras are visionary text of people who have visions of the Buddha. Now, as I say, we don't know. The Mahayana Sutra texts do not say where they come from. It's very different from the Tantra. If you study the Tantra, the great Tantra, Goya Samadhi, Mantaka, and so on, they all were taught, they all were received by yogis whose name we have. And so we know they are visionary teachings. They tell us they are visionary teachings, right? They say outright, this is a visionary teaching. Now, the Kala Chakra, I put it aside, but most of the great Tantras are taught as visionary teaching. In the Nyingma tradition, we have that tradition, which is called the Terma tradition, which is the idea that the visionary texts that are the Tantra are not limited to texts that come from India, but continue to be received by people in visions, in mystical visions, and this vision continues up to nowadays, and this is what termas are, right? Termas in the Nyingma tradition are visionary texts that are received by people in actually quite complicated way, but basically we know that these texts are visionary texts, right? So my hypothesis is that this is the case of the Mahayana Sutra, though the Mahayana Sutra do not tell us how they came about, right? And that remains And so it remains an open question. Who is right? Is this the teaching of the historical Buddha? I think this is extremely unlikely, given the style, the way they have written, the setup, and so on is so different from the basic sutra that it's extremely unlikely that these are secret teachings given to some disciples. Some people believe that. I personally think that this is very, very unlikely. What is more likely, I think, is that these are visionary texts, right? These are texts received by people in visions from who have visions from visions of the Buddha, right? We have visionary phenomena even in the Theravada tradition. The most famous arhat of the 20th century is called Achanman, and he's said to have visions of the Buddha. Now, this was an enormous scandal in the Theravada tradition, because in the Theravada tradition, the Buddha has long passed away, and so he's not supposed to appear in visions, right? But visions are a widespread, shared religious phenomena across many traditions, and so it's not surprising at all if these Mahayana sutras are the result of visionary experience that were received by some practitioners in the first centuries of the Common Era in India, or in the vast Indian subcontinent, and that these teachings were written down and passed down to next generations, right? And so I think this is probably the most likely, but obviously we don't know because they don't tell us where they come from. Any question about that? This gives you an idea of what is a Mahayana Sutra. Mahayana Sutra is a sutra that teach that the bodhisattva path should be the normative path of Buddhists. And this text are mysterious from where they appear, but I gave you 3 alternatives to explain how they appear. Yes? Do you have a question, Gail?
Yeah, I think Gail has a question.
A Sangha?
Yeah, Asanga had visions too, right? Of Maitreya, right?
Yes.
Yes. So visionary experiences are widely known and shared across Buddhist traditions, even Theravada, though this is not accepted, but they exist. And then they are shared across many different religious traditions, right? Christian mystics had visionary experiences and so on. So it's nothing extraordinary, right? I mean, it is extraordinary, but it's not unique to Mahayana tradition, right?
Nice.
It's in fact widely shared across religious tradition. And in Tibet, we still have a continuous visionary tradition of termas that exist, that are revealed up to this day, right? We have modern terma revealer even nowadays in Tibet, right? What's intriguing is that they don't happen outside of Tibet. More questions?
I had a question.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes?
sorry, Amy, go ahead.
Okay, just an example of a visionary in the Theravadan tradition.
It's this experience of Ajahn Man, who was this arhat, this monk who was regarded by everybody as an arhat in Thailand, lived around the first half of the 20th century. And he, in his meditations, he saw the Buddha and he taught to talk to the Buddha and he received teaching from the Buddha. Now, in the Theravada, this was a total scandal because this was revealed when his disciple wrote his biography. And this was thought to be an enormous scandal in the Theravada tradition, because in the Theravada tradition, the Buddha has disappeared, right? He's passed in nirvana, right? He's gone beyond, right? He's not there.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So in Theravada, they thought, now the Sri Lankan thought, well, this shows that Thais are not serious Theravada Buddhists. And Sri Lankans would say, we knew that because Thais meditate too much and good Theravada Buddhists should not meditate that much. That's dangerous. That's studying Sutra. Sutta is what they should primarily do, right? That's a Sri Lankan version of, they don't like Thais. They think Thais are way too loose. In fact, if you go in Thai Buddhist, it's really interesting. They have meditation that look like Mahamudra and so on. So there is a lot of interesting stuff. There is a lot also of crossover across India to Burma to Thailand, particularly coming from Assam. And so there is a lot of interesting teachings in Burma, Northern Burma, and Northern Thailand that do look to us like something like Tantra, but they're not taught as Tantra, but they are somewhat similar. And so from a Sri Lankan point of view, this is not orthodox, right?
Thank you.
You had a question?
Yeah, Larry, did you still have a question? You had your hand up.
I just wondered how many Mahayana sutras there are.
I don't know, but many.
More than Theravada?
Theravada is one of the schools that is based on the early part of the canon. In India, there were other schools. For example, there was a school called Sarvastivada, and that's a school that transmitted its Vinaya and its basic Buddhist teachings to Tibet. And there were another school called Mahasangika, and that school transmitted its text to China. All these schools were basic Buddhist schools. They're based on the early part of the Buddhist canon, meaning the Sutta and Vinaya that were rehearsed after the passing away of the Buddha, and then were later transmitted orally and then written down later and translated into various language.
And
That's what I call basic Buddhism.
every school had its own sutras?
They are very similar. They are very similar. The Vinaya is very similar. And so the teachings are very similar. So we can see that this is similar, very, very similar text. And so we can think that, yeah, we know more or less what early Buddhism looked like, or at least we can make some speculation.
Right, so there's a defined canon, but is there a defined canon for the Mahayana sutras?
Well, the Mahayana Sutras are these texts that appear after, right?
Right.
Once all these early texts were rehearsed, transmitted, suddenly you have this new text that appear, right?
Right, how many?
Many, hundreds,
Hundreds?
yeah, at least. I'm not a sutra scholar, so I
Yeah.
don't know, but there are many more Mahayana Sutra than there are basic Buddhist Sutra.
Hmm.
Like if you look in the Tibetan canon, it goes like basic Buddhist Sutra, then double or triple, or I don't know how many more Mahayana Sutra, and then again double, triple, or I don't know more Tantras.
Thank you.
Yeah, Catherine, you need to unmute.
Okay, very quickly. So you had said about three possible origins. One is a lay, a sort of a lay movement. One is a mystical movement, but I don't remember now the third one.
Third one is a traditional account that some people like that the Mahayana Sutra were buried, entrusted to, for example, the Nagas, right? You know, the legend of Nagarjuna who went down to the land of the Naga and got the Prajnaparamita Sutras, right? So it's this kind of traditional account that they were taught by Buddha Shakyamuni, but then they were hidden away and then retrieved by people like Nagarjuna.
Okay, thanks. And just again,
But this is just, this is not what the texts themselves say, right? Nagarjuna is just a legend, right? It's a narrative, let's say, not to put a judgment of value on that. It's just a narrative. The sutras themselves never say where they come from.
And just the word rehearsed, it's an interesting word if as opposed to transmitted. Can you say more about the word rehearse?
Rehearse is when the disciples met and heard the way they deal, the way the account goes is that they basically met after the passing away of the Buddha, and they asked Ananda, the attendant of the Buddha, to explain what he remembers from the teachings of the Buddha. That's what, and then when everybody agrees, that's what we call rehearsed.
Oh, thank you.
And that's what's called the first rehearsal. Some people called it the first council, but that the word council is totally inappropriate because there is no church in Buddhism. And so this is what we use the word rehearse, right?
Thank you.
Which is actually, the Tibetan word is kadupa, which means something like collected the words. So it's relatively close.
Thank you.
Yeah, Gail?
So the Tibetan Kongyur and Tengyur,
No, Kengyu, not Tengyu.
that's the Shastras, the
Yeah,
commentary.
Tengyu is the commentary.
Yeah, but the Kongyur are the Mahayana Sutras?
No, there are basic Buddhist sutras, what I call basic Buddhist,
Okay.
which is before the Mahayana sutras appear. There are minor sutras and there are tantras.
All right, thank you.
Now, it is fair to say that there are very fewer basic Buddhist sutra in the Tibetan canon than in the Pali or the Chinese canon. They have a lot more of these basic Buddhist teachings. But Tibetans have their own set of basic Buddhist teaching, and then they have Mahayana teaching, and then the Tantra.
Thank you.
That's a Kangyu. Tengyur is what I really know a lot more about, which is the Shastra, because in monastery, we work with the Shastra because it's a lot easier than the Sutra. You have a question?
Yes, Professor, I wanted to ask you, I'm still like trying to think about your question, why this shift from like arhats to bodhisattvas, something that is so much more harder to attain.
Yes.
And I was wondering because, at that time there were also.
And arhat is hard enough, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
But at that time, you also had all the non-Buddhist schools.
Yes, that's true.
Who had a more, I don't know, maybe because I'm
Theistic.
Hindu, it's easier, like everybody
No,
can.
it had a more theistic approach.
Yeah.
Because what you see is also at that time, you see the rise of theism in Hinduism, right? And that's, some people have speculated that Mahayana is a response to the rise of Hindu theism. Another theory.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
Yeah.
Because in some
Mahayana
ways,
is really
yeah.
mysterious because it doesn't tell us where it's coming from, right? Which is really interesting. So when I say there are three theories, you should not think that's all what there is. There are many more. Because precisely Mahayana sutras don't tell us where they are coming from. And so Western scholars, modern scholars, not Western, modern scholars, because there are plenty of Japanese scholars who write about the origin of the Mahayana, modern scholars have basically speculated, and that's it. We don't know, but we can all make this interesting speculation about where this text come from, right? Was there another hand? Yeah. Jump in.
I have a question. You said that the Tibetans have their own basic
Buddhist
sutras.
sutras,
So
yes,
how do
obviously.
they differ from
No,
what is left out, or?
no, they're basically similar to, like, for example, what's this text? Uddhavaga. Uddhavaga is part of the Tibetan canon. It's very similar to the Dhammapada that you find in the Theravada tradition. So the texts are relatively similar. It's just the Pali canon has a lot more text than the basic Buddhist text in the Kangyo, right?
Thank you. Yeah.
More questions? Okay, so what is this sutra about? Well, that's where it gets really complicated. So I am going to page 18. I really encourage you to get the book, at least for next time, because basically I'm going to read part of the book and then speculate of what this could mean. And so on page 18, it says, the purity of his Buddha field is talking about the Buddha reflects the purity of living beings. The purity of living beings reflect the purities of his gnosis. The purity of his gnosis reflects the purity of his doctrine. The purity of his doctrine reflects the purity of his transcendental practice, meaning paramita. And the purity of his paramita reflects the purity of his own mind. Thereupon, magically influenced by the Buddha, the venerable Shariputra had this fault. If the Buddha field is pure only to the extent that the mind of the bodhisattva is pure, then when Buddha Shakyamuni was engaged in the career of bodhisattva, his mind must have been impure. Otherwise, how could this Buddha field appear to be so impure? The Buddha, knowing telepathically the thought of Venerable Shariputra, said to him, what do you think, Shariputra? Is it because the sun and moon are impure that those blind from birth do not see? Shariputra replied, no, it is not so. The fault lies with those blind from birth and not with the sun and moon. The Buddha declared, in the same way, Shariputra, the fact that some living beings do not behold the splendid display of virtue of the Buddha field of the Tathagata is due to their ignorance. Okay. So what the sutra is going to be about is the purification of the Buddha field. So question, what does it mean, the purification of the Buddha field? And where is the impurity? This is the topic of the sutra, the purification of the Buddha field.
It seems as if the impurity is in the capacity of the people who are apprehending the Buddha field, not in the Buddha field itself.
Yes, but does that mean that our earth is a Buddha field and we don't know?
I think it
I don't-
reminds me, sorry.
Go ahead, Snake.
No, go ahead, Richard. Go ahead, please.
Well, I think the
You're
answer to the
courageous,
question,
Richard.
yeah, I'm sorry.
You're courageous because this is not an easy question, right?
Well, I think that, I think that the question, I think that the answer is yes. I think it's saying that if we perceive the world, if we perceive the earth the right way, it is a pure Buddha field, and that there's something wrong with our perceptions, the way that we
Okay,
perceive it.
okay. Somebody else wanted to say something?
I was just going to add to Richard's comment, which is that this reminds me of that Yogacara example of, the same liquid being perceived as nectar, pus, and
Okay.
water,
Yeah,
depending on the sense, the capacity of someone's senses or the purity of someone's senses.
so you basically are Yogacharan, right? Okay.
Yes.
I thought the ultimate view was Prasangika, but I guess I'm wrong, right? Just kidding. So this is the topic, right? The purification of the Buddha field, right? And so question is our Buddha field, is our place a Buddha field or not? The text doesn't say that, right? It does say that the contrast is between the bodhisattva and the disciple, right? Shariputra, right? And Shariputra does not understand that the bodhisattva mind is pure, right? Okay. Then come Vimalakirti, right? Who is Vimalakirti? And what is happening to him?
Isn't he sick? And he was
Yes,
sick
he's sick, exactly.
and nobody wanted to visit him.
Yeah. So why is he sick?
I don't remember.
Gail, nobody hears you.
Is that better?
Yeah, much
No,
better.
he is sick in order to teach the Dharma.
Okay.
So he's pretending to be sick.
Is he
He's
pretending
taking
or
on-
is he sick? Or is he sick because sentient beings are sick?
I kind of thought he wasn't sick at all, but he only
Okay.
he took on the guise of sickness. He
To
took the
do
role of being
what?
sick in order to be the example and get people to come to him so that he could teach them.
Oh, it's trick them, right?
Yeah,
Okay, so he's like a Zen master, right? Which is actually Zen tradition loves this Vimalakirti Sutra because, yeah, it looks like a Zen master, right? Yeah,
He says in paragraph 4.7, Manjushri, my sickness comes from ignorance and the thirst for existence, and it will last as long as do the sicknesses of all living beings.
yep, exactly. So what do you make of that? You see,
Well,
but you understand why I said this is a difficult text, right?
oh, yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
because
it's tricky.
At first, it looks like this is easy, it's narrative, it's fun. Did you find the text fun? Because I personally find the text hilarious. But when I taught it before, I don't teach it anymore, but when I taught it, my students were offended.
Why were they offended?
Because Vimalakirti was making fun of all these monks. And my students thought, this is not funny, this is mean. Me coming from a much older generation, I thought, yeah, this is fun. I don't know what you thought.
I haven't read it completely yet.
But did you laugh or did you think like he was mean?
Well, I found it kind of funny that all the that whenever the Buddha would say, "Hey, you go over there and talk to this guy," they all had these elaborate excuses for why they couldn't.
Exactly. Like one day I was there and I was teaching, and then the Vimalakirti came along and say, "How can you teach?" and so on, right? Yeah. And so you found that fun or you found that mean?
Well, I think I'm closer to your generation. I found it kind of funny.
Okay. We old fogies, so we are all 60 people.
I find it kind of, I lean toward the mean side.
You're the mean side. Okay, so it's not just generation. My students were really offended, and I was like, don't you find this hilarious? They were like, no. Okay. What's that?
What you just read, that sentence, the purity of his Buddha field reflects the purity of living beings.
Yes.
That to me itself is a paradox.
Yes, I told you it's a really difficult text. I don't understand the text. For example, what does it mean that Vimalakirti is sick? You said he appears to be sick. They say this is the sickness of all sentient beings, right? What does it mean?
Doesn't it mean ignorance?
Yeah. And so what does it mean that Vimalakirti is sick?
I think it's what Richard had read before when he was speaking to Manjushri, saying, because all sentient beings have the sickness of ignorance and all the afflictions and stuff, and they just keep suffering. Like,
yes,
they're always in pain, and they need medicine.
No doubt about that, but that doesn't mean that Vimalakirti himself is sick, right? Now you can say he's pretending to be sick.
He is like
now there is a lot of
that
in the Tibetan tradition where you're pretending like, and okay, I'm not sure how far it takes us.
Or he's like a proxy, like a stand-in for all of us.
Well, no, not really. At least that's not how I understand that. Richard is on the right path when he says sickness stands for ignorance, right? So the question is, what does it mean to say that he's sick with ignorance, right? And that's what the bodhisattva path is all about, right? Is dealing with this sickness of ignorance without eliminating it, right? And that's what the path of the bodhisattva is all about, right? The idea of the bodhisattva is that if the bodhisattva wanted, he could attain an arhathood immediately, within a short time, right? But the bodhisattva doesn't do that. He remains in samsara in order to develop all the perfections, right? And that's the sickness of Vimalakirti. Vimalakirti is sick because he is still in samsara, right? Why is he in samsara? Is to help sentient beings and to develop himself all the perfections, right? Perfections of helping other and perfection for oneself. And that's the teaching of the Mahayana sutras, right? That disciples, Buddhists should not pass into nirvana. They should bear, they should have patience, they should have forbearance to stay in samsara in order to help others and thereby develop all the virtues that they need to become fully enlightened Buddha, right? And that's the sickness of Vimalakirti, because Vimalakirti is sick because all sentient beings are sick. And Vimalakirti is going to be sick only as long as he is in samsara, right? That's the teaching of this sutra, right? That's why Vimalakirti is sick, right? He's sick because he's still in samsara, and therefore he's sick of the suffering of all sentient beings because he has not yet developed all the virtues that are needed, all the perfection, the paramita that are needed to become fully enlightened, right?
So is this sickness, the fact that, is this all about pervasive suffering? Is that what it is all about?
No, it's about ignorance.
Well, ignorance.
It's about duality. It's about duality, and it's about remaining in duality, remaining in samsara in order to help others and acquire all the virtues that one needs to become a fully enlightened Buddha. Right? I know it's difficult. I told you, this is much more difficult than Madhyamika. Madhyamika is, you just do a little bit of reasoning and you get there. It's not difficult. It's pretty easy. In 2 years, you have it covered. This is 7 years of study, and after studying for 7 years, you still don't know a tenth of it. This is Mahayana path. Sorry, Richard, you were saying?
Yeah, I had a question, which is, does Vimalakirti staying in samsara, is that because he doesn't, is that because he hasn't purified completely, or is that basically the choice of a being who has purified completely, but is staying there in order to bring everybody else?
Yeah, that's, I'm not sure we know at this point. Because if I remember the end, he reveals himself as a Buddha, but I'm not sure about that. But at that point, we don't know. He's sick, and we understand his sickness is not ordinary because it's a sickness of all sentient beings, right? And as you said very rightly, it's a sickness of ignorance, right? And so he's sick of ignorance, meaning he's still in duality, is still live in this world of samsara, right? And he does this in order to help others and to acquire all the perfections that are needed to become a fully enlightened Buddha, right? That's the fundamental teaching of this sutra, right? Which is,
Professor,
yes?
I was going to say, but I remember reading the sutra years ago, and there's that chapter where, he needs to bring fragrance as food. And so he, calls upon all these bodhisattvas from
Yes.
and that's why I never thought of him. I always, in my mind, was because he could do these amazing things, right? Like make people sit on these huge thrones, that he was
Yes.
really a bodhisattva. Like he's not, like this is just all for me, like pretend, like I'm pretending to be sick, but he has these amazing powers and capacities.
Yes, it does. That's why I said I'm not sure whether it's, we can understand it in two ways. One, he's a bodhisattva and he's sick with ignorance, meaning he's still part of duality, right? The other is that he plays a role, but I think playing a role is much less interesting than the first explanation, because the heart of the Mahayana teaching is this middle way between nirvana and samsara, right? And that's hard to understand until you understand that the bodhisattva is not seeking nirvana because he's not seeking liberation for himself or herself, but he's seeking full enlightenment, right? Which is the perfection of helping self and others, right? And that's what's called the equality of samsara and nirvana, right? And so the sickness of Vimalakirti, I think, is about the fact that the bodhisattva stays in samsara in order to reach full perfection rather than go immediately into nirvana, right? Which is how actually basic Buddhists explain the difference between a bodhisattva and an arhat. The arhat seeks enlightenment and passes away into nirvana, whereas the bodhisattva, meaning the exceptional person who seeks full enlightenment, refuses to pass into nirvana, remains in samsara to help others and develop all the perfections that are needed for full enlightenment, right? And that's how Theravada texts present the difference between bodhisattvas and arhat, right? More questions? So the last one more thing, why is he a layperson? Why is he a layperson? If he's so amazing, why is he a layperson? Now, some people say it's because Mahayana was a lay movement, and that's why bodhisattvas are not ordained. I think I'm not sure about this interpretation. I think there is a much clearer, if you want, symbolic interpretation, which is that Vimalakirti is a layperson because a layperson is more able to help others, right? Help others in all kinds of ways, whereas a monk or a nun are much more restricted in helping others, right? Because the monk and nuns cannot touch money, they cannot touch people of the other gender and so on. They have a lot of restriction. They cannot spend the night outside of the monastery, etc., etc. Monks have tons of restrictions. And so a lay person is much likely to be able to help others, right? Now, understand that for me, Vimalakirti is a literary figure, right? And so the question is not who he is really, but the question is, why is the text depicting him in this way, right? And it depicted him in this way because it meant to show that what is important in the Mahayana tradition is really to help others. And that's why the bodhisattva, most of the time, bodhisattvas in the Mahayana Sutra are all depicted as lay people, right? Because lay people are much more able to help others, and that's why they're presented in this way, right? Other people say that's for historical reason, because the Mahayana tradition was at first a lay movement. These two explanations obviously are not contradictory, but we don't know whether the Mahayana was really a lay movement. In fact, most of modern scholars disfavor this theory, though it is still one of the accepted theory, one of the possible explanations of the rise of the Mahayana Sutras. Any question? So, when the Lichavi Vimalakirti thought to himself, I am sick, lying on my bed in pain. Yet the Tathagata, the saint, the perfectly accomplished Buddha, does not consider me or take pity upon me and send no one to inquire after my illness. What do you make of that? Isn't that strange? That Vimalakirti, who has all this extraordinary magical power, kind of complains like, poor me. No, the Buddha doesn't want to send somebody to visit me. Interesting, right? I don't know what to make of it. I told you, this text is really difficult. It's like, so you could say it's all skillful means, meaning that Vimalakirti pretends to, he knows perfectly well, because he has all this magical power, so he must know that the Buddha is going to send all these disciples, right? Or maybe there is something else. I don't know. It's a strange line. And then after that, it's much more clear what's going on. The Buddha says one by one to his disciples, go and inquire about the health of Vimalakirti, right? And so one after the other, Shariputra, Moggallana, Mahakashyapa, Subhuti, then there is even Katayana and Upali, Rahula, the own son of the Buddha, and then finally Ananda. They all declined to go to see Vimalakirti because he was mean to them, right? And this is where my students and I disagree because I think that's the funniest part of the sutra, but my student found that Vimalakirti is just mean. Yeah, Catherine?
Yeah, you were saying about the, the lay person being more available to help people. And
Yeah.
when you say, oh, nobody's coming, is there an indirect criticism that they are monk they cannot do the same job of visiting a sick person?
Okay, that's a really interesting idea. Because, yeah, no, that's very insightful. That's good. Obviously, this text is a piece of, it's not just a piece of literature, it's also a piece of rhetoric, right? It's a very rhetorical text. And what is its rhetoric? Well, its rhetoric is not difficult to understand. It's a put down of basic Buddhism, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's this Mahayana movement, which is arising in India and which at some point becomes self-conscious, right? And when this movement becomes self-conscious, it sets itself as a critique of basic Buddhism, because and present basic Buddhism as Hinayana, right? As the small vehicle, and then present itself as Mahayana, as the great vehicle, right? And so this would then be part of this kind of rhetoric of the sutra, which is arguing for its movement, of which it is one of the texts, right? And this movement is saying, no, you should not try to become arhat. This is way too limited. You should, right from the first, join us and try to become a bodhisattva and aspire to become a Buddha, right? Because this is the most important, the great path, right? This is the great vehicle, the Mahayana. The early Mahayana texts are often described as proto-Mahayana by Western scholars, because they do not take this heavy rhetoric of kind of putting down basic Buddhist practices in order to extol the practice of the bodhisattva, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this text clearly does, and it's done when all the disciples called one by the Buddha, and they all say, I am reluctant to go. When I went, Vimalakirti made fun of me. He said, this is not the way you observe yourself in contemplation, etc., right? And this is part of the Mahayana rhetoric, when Mahayana become a self-conscious movement, which explicitly sets itself distinct, not in opposition, but as distinct from the basic Buddhist approach, which says, if you're Mozart, you can become a bodhisattva. If not, you should try to become an arhat. This is already hard enough.
Right.
More questions? I think we are basically done for today. Any more questions? So basically, we got to page 33, right? And then after that, we are going to see the reluctance of the bodhisattva, which is not very surprising. What we really want to talk about is the consolation of the invalid, which is going to be talking about Vimalakirti's house and his sickness again, right? And that will be chapter 5, which we'll do next time. Chapter 5 and 6 are going together. And then there is chapter 7, the goddess. So this is for the next time. Any more questions? As you can see, this is hard going. Richard?
Yeah, I was just wondering in terms of how the Mahayana came about, whether or not there were any socio-political kind of questions. I mean, if what's going on in this text is the kind of elevation of the layperson to the status of a bodhisattva, it makes me wonder whether or not there was some reason why the monastic community wanted to curry favor, if you will. I may be a little cynical to say that, but those sorts of thoughts came through my mind.
Yes, and you would be, I mean, I don't know whether it's right or not. As I say, this all are speculations, because as you may know, doing history in ancient India is not an easy task, because we have so few written records which are reliable. It's extremely difficult to think about history basically prior to the Muslim invasion, right? China is a completely different place. You know, we have records down to the day it was written and so on. But India, we have very few records. And so it's highly speculative. But yeah, one of his hypotheses is that Mahayana is a lay movement because it wants to praise the lay practitioner, right? And that's one way to understand the Mahayana. I don't know whether it's true or not, but that's certainly noticeable that all the bodhisattvas in the text are lay people, right? Yeah, it's strange from a basic Buddhist point of view, because the Sangha is supposed to be the heart of the Buddhist tradition, right? So this is obviously, at least at the level of the literature, it's really a kind of inverting the hierarchy, right? And we don't know whether this was like this was reflected the social movement, or whether this is purely a literary device, right? In order to veiculate certain teachings about the primacy of helping others, which is what Mahayana is, the bodhisattva ideal is all about, right? The first records we have is from around 5th century, something like this, when the first Chinese pilgrims get to India, right? I Ching and Xuanzang. And so this is, and there we don't see the Mahayana movement as a lay movement, right? We see Mahayana movement as having a strong, at least monastic component. But obviously, let's say it's a 5th century AD. So this is already 2 or 3 centuries later than the early Mahayana, right? And so we don't know. It's also the case that, but that's going to be later, that India, that one of the great disadvantage of Buddhism in India, okay, first it was an advantage, then it became a disadvantage. It's a way it treats kings, right? Now, in the Vedas, the kings are not given a lot of prestige because they are below the Brahmin, right? And so the Buddhists rose in India by giving kings a lot of prestige. And we see that in various figures like Ashoka and so on, right? King Ashoka and various Buddhist kings in ancient India, right? And so kings were given an enormous importance in Buddhism. And that was an advantage. But then the Hindu replied by making kings God, right? By making kings a manifestation of Shiva, Vishnu, and so on. And so, yeah, the Buddhists lost the competition. Now, one way to understand the bodhisattva maybe is to give lay people, meaning the king, greater power. That is not an uninteresting hypothesis. The fact is that Buddhism lost in India, right? And one of the reasons it lost in India is that kings basically at the end of the day sided with Hindus because it's a lot more fun to be Shiva than to be even a bodhisattva, right? So yeah, this is an interest, it's another dimension of the question of why bodhisattvas are all depicted as lay people, right? Any more questions? Okay, so we'll meet next time, next Monday, try to get the book. We'll do chapter 5, 6, and hopefully we get to 7. And this will be, and then the family of the Tathagata, and the finally chapter will be our 3rd meeting. Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Have a good night.
Thank you very
Good
much.
night.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Good night.
Sunny.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.